Mi nombre es Jen, él es mi compañero José Eduardo y juntos trabajamos con una colectiva que se llama Antena Los Ángeles.
My name is Jen, this is my compañero José Eduardo, and together we work with a collective called, a language justice collective called Antena Los Ángeles.
Ahorita vamos a cambiar interpretación simultánea usando el equipo de interpretación.
So right now we're going to be switching to simultaneous interpretation using the interpretation equipment.
As I said, I'm Louise Steinman, the program director for the Library Foundation. We are thrilled to have you here today for this program titled Threat of Extinction, Language Activism, and Preservation. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a minute. One of the questions we're posing really is, why does language matter? Why should we care when a language goes extinct, when a massive, complex constellation of ideas, knowledge about time, seasons, sea creatures, flowers, landscapes, music, deer, the unknown and the everyday ceases to exist? What do we stand to lose? Or more accurately, do we even know what we stand to lose? And if a language dies out, can it be revitalized? Today's panelists care deeply about these questions, and they are addressing them in various and ingenious ways. And thanks to support to the Library Foundation from the Getty as part of their Pacific Standard Time LA initiative, we're so thrilled to be able to assemble this extraordinary group of language activists to discuss both language extinction and language revival. So, starting to my immediate left is Leanne Hinton, our moderator today, Professor Emerita of Linguistics at UC Berkeley and advisory member of the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. Leanne has long worked and written about the field of language revitalization and has helped design language learning methods now used worldwide. To her left, Vincent Medina, an indigenous language activist and a leader in the movement to revive Chocheño as a spoken language. Vincent has been a longtime contributor to the publication News from Native California and the author of the blog Being Ohlone in the 21st Century. In the middle there, we have Odilia Romero Hernández, who is indigenous Zapotec from the northern mountains in the state of Oaxaca and is based here in Los Angeles. She's worked for many years with indigenous Mexican and binational organizations in the areas of human rights, cultural, and political education, and she's vice binational coordinator of FIOB, the Indigenous Front of Binational Organizations. To her left is Bob Holman, a veteran of the spoken word and slam poetry movement of the last several decades. Some of you might have seen the entirety of the documentary he co-produced and hosted, Language Matters, which we showed earlier today. Bob is joining us from his home in New York City today, and he is the co-founder and co-director, among many other hats, of the Endangered Language Alliance. And we have Virginia Carmelo, who has served as tribal chair and tribal council member of the Gabrielino Tongva Nation. We are on Tongva land, as Jen noted, the tribe indigenous to the Los Angeles Basin, and she's been working for many years to research and revitalize Tongva tribal song, dance, and regalia. It is such an honor to welcome you and to welcome our wonderful panelists. Please enjoy this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think we'll be speaking for about an hour or a little less, perhaps, and then we will have time for questions as well. So I'm happy to see all of you, including people that I know some, and the rest of you look very interesting. We're going to have the panelists reintroduce themselves, those who to say things that might have been left out. And we're hoping that those who speak an indigenous language will introduce themselves in their language, just so you can hear it. So we'll start with Vince.
Warshatu hi makam, kana krakats Vince Medina, kana kalkin saklan napa aye elamne taresh, ekruak marote awash te nomo. Nehoshe nomo rote nomo te warep te tongva muakma ye rote nomo rote ne warep tak. Kanak ukshere tak eknunu eknono aye ekmam makamham rote ek maknan irakat Luis rote nomo aye. Kanak chocho te Mariacha Leda, Luis Ayubani Medina, Ernestine Gonzalez, Aye Kanak Inish te Vince Medina Sr., Aye Tina Medina. Kish kanak roket ashlip kanak rote nomo ne hoshe warap te himmen nesa. So hello to you all in my language, in Chochenyo, and I'm going to self-translate. What I said is, my name is Vince Medina. I am Ohlone. My homeland is north of here, in the area of what we now call the East Bay, where Oakland and Berkeley is at today. That's my homeland. That's our indigenous home where we're descended from. I work with my language. I work to revive these words of my culture, words that haven't been spoken in my family for about 70 years. And my generation, guided by our elders, have worked tirelessly to bring these words back home. I work with language as part of a process of decolonization of our culture, and language is one part of this, but it's connected to many other elements such as food, story, song, dances, many other things that would be spoken about. And I said I'm grateful to be here in the land of the Tongva, where Virginia is indigenous too, and glad to be here with you all. Thank you.
Padiush nedaria Odilia Romero. Zua shujo, bener shujo neda. Na zua Los Ángeles, yesh chebene ulaganis. Yesh tabeseke. Chebene Tongva. My name is Odilia Romero. I'm from the community of Sogocho. I live here in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, the city that now belongs to the people that crossed the oceans, but originally belonged to the Tongvas.
Hi, I'm Bob Holman. Pico is a Hawaiian word that means, among other things, the place where your parents buried your umbilical cord. So the next time somebody asks you where you're from, just tell them that your parents buried your umbilical cord wherever you figure they would have. You know, in Hawaii, it's different. I'm a poet, and poets have been using language for thousands of years, rent-free. And now it's payback time. As languages disappear, poets lose the stuff that they need to work with. My mother is the daughter of a Kentucky coal miner. She married the only Jew in Harlan, Kentucky, where she and my father, Benjamin, whose parents came from Kamenets-Podolsky in Ukraine, buried my Pico. And I'm honored to be here.
Meiha we'ene hiken netwanyane Virginia Carmelo hawesh kone equare. Hello everyone, I'm Virginia Carmelo, and I'm happy you're all here today. I am Tongva, Gabrielino, and our ancestral lands are the entire Los Angeles basin, including the 4 Channel Islands, in our ocean over here to the west. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So one of the things that we want to get across today is that there's an enormous diversity of languages in the world and in North America. It's listed as about 170 indigenous languages that are endemic to the United States. And I heard the number 65 or 66 in Mexico, except that's an undercount because when you look at, for example, Zapotec, actually many people that speak Zapotec speak a language that's different enough from each other that they can't understand each other. So even Zapotec is more of a language family. And so in California alone, there's over 80 indigenous languages. So about half the languages of the United States are here in California. And yet, most of them have no speakers anymore. And if they do have speakers, it's maybe 1 or 2 or 3 who are quite elderly. And we've lost several of the last speakers of their languages just in this year. We're seeing the decline as we go. So a lot is lost when we lose a language. And I sort of want to start out with the question, though, of a lot of people say, well, why don't we all speak English anyway? Because then we can communicate with each other better, and you don't have to have translators and so forth. But there's a beauty in language diversity. And I wonder if any of you would like to just speak about that beauty. I know Bob, for example, is like me, that we're language collectors. We love all languages. I'm from the linguistic end of things, and he's from the poetic end of things. But language diversity itself seems to have a lot of advantages, even despite the disadvantages that people see about communication. Bob, what would you have to say about that?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I've just seen some photos backstage of Vincent's new culinary linguistic IPO, you know, and looking at the incredible acorn flatbreads and delicious duck breasts in raspberry sauce, or some berry sauce, sort of made me hungry. And I realized I was getting hungry for what these foods were called and what they were about and where they came from. So I'm going to toss that dish right back over to you, Vincent. What for you? How do you get from this formal setting of talking about language to sitting down in front of a luncheon of duck breast and acorn bread?
Well, language got me to duck by many different ways, but the one way is by connecting many different aspects of culture that's grounded and rooted in the foundation of language. Now, we know that in my history, in my community, which is similar to many histories of people who were affected by the California missions, it's been about over 200 years of people trying to take our cultures from us, trying to take our languages, our foods, our stories, trying to take the things that are indigenous to this place from us, to try to assimilate us to be Western, to be more like people who are colonizing and conquering this place. The thing, though, is that our ancestors, just like ourselves today, never wanted to give up those things that matter. We didn't want to give up our languages. That's why they're documented. We didn't want to give up these stories that stretch back to the very beginning of time. We didn't want to give up these foods that our ancestors cherished and loved. We didn't want to give up any of these things that matter to us. And our ancestors, just like our elders today, found and continue to find ways to keep these things alive in the spite of extreme hardships that our communities have to face. Hardship that's not simply in the past, but sustained and still continuing in the present form today in 2017 as well. And so connecting back to duck, though, from language, inside of these ethnographic notes that exist, thousands of pages of ethnographic notes that our elders, that our ancestors left for us that were recorded in the 1920s and 30s, handwritten, scribbled down, because these people were the last of their speakers, the last of that generation that could remember these old words that have been spoken for us since the very beginning. Inside of these notes, they left much more than language, but they left stories. They left creation. They left their memories of creation. They left our values embedded in those old notes. They talked about the injustice that our community saw. They talked about the foods that they loved. They talked about ways to gather. They talked about every little bit that they could talk about that was relevant to keeping our culture alive, because they knew it was meant to continue. And so when we eat these foods, these old foods, it's a part of the decolonization process that I mentioned when I was introducing myself, is we don't want just simply language back, but we want everything back. We want one day all Ohlone children in my community to have a Ohlone language in their lives, to have these stories that our ancestors connected to, that ground us in our religion and in our values, told again. People want our foods cooked again at every single dinner table. They want our values instilled so that they'll last forever. This was the goal of our people, and this goal is still continuing. We still want this. It's not over. And so being able to eat these foods, along with language, being a part of them, connects us to our people through taste. We taste those same flavors that they tasted. We commune with them in this way. And when we add language to it, when we say this duck, it's not called duck, but it's called shakani. This berry sauce, it's not called berry sauce, but it's called enis min shakani. When we add these things to the language, we have this holistic experience of reconnecting back into that old world. And we feel stronger connected to our ancestors. And it makes us collectively stronger. So in that way, duck is connected to language, but many other things besides duck come from language as well.
Yeah. Well, Odilia I've also seen in our conversations with you just in the last few hours that language and culture is just not separable. That and for you, there's language. You also have a food aspect to cultural maintenance here in Los Angeles, and you have issues of justice and the culture of Zapotec culture and the difficulties, for example, of translating into English what the Zapotec people here are experiencing, and the difficulties of translating for them the completely different culture of say, the courts here in California. If you'd like to talk a little bit about what you've experienced with language and all aspects of culture that you're trying to deal with here.
Well, language, or the tongue, is an important part of human beings. We can't leave behind those of us who still speak our language, those of us who still have our language. We should not allow others to make us see the world as if it only had one color. And when we speak English, if everyone in the world were to speak English, we would be seeing the entire world through a Western vision. We would not be seeing many of the worlds that exist. It's an obligation. It's a duty to continue with our languages. You can't eat bread every single day and have the same taste of wheat every day. Life would be extremely boring. In the same way, you can't eat beans every single day for 3 meals a day. It would be very boring, right? That's how our world would be without all of the languages of that world. That's how my world would be without Zapoteco. Since they came, the first thing they attacked was our food and our tongue. The first thing you lose, I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to tell you a story. I was talking the other day with someone, and the person said to me, well, in my language, you say La Virgen Tonash. That's what you say in my language. So I made a publication on my Facebook wall, and I asked, what does Tronash mean to you in your Zapoteco? And everyone said, virgin. In our world, the virgin doesn't exist. So we began to change, and we began to give a different concept to the Virgin Mary. But Shonaj is the maximum example of what a woman can be. If you refer to your grandmother, you might use that word for her. You might say that she's your virgen, your virgin. But what it means is that she's the quintessential woman. So what this means is that at times we've been forced to change the meaning of our languages. There's a term that's used very, very often for witch or for wizard. What a horrible thing. Brujo, wizard, witch. But if you take apart bene, the word in Zapoteco, bene is person, wa is to carry, and ja is the day. That is, person who carries the day, the person who knows the calendar. Where do we get wizard or witch from that? We impose that idea, and they force us to see ourselves differently from how our own spirituality is, changing our Shunaj into a virgin, and changing our Benoit into a witch or a wizard, making us see everything from their perspective, to see ourselves as less than. What a horrible thing a witch is, or a wizard is. But we never, and we lose the respect for the person who counts the days of the calendar of our peoples. And the same thing happens with food. They start to change. Amaranth turns into flour, and our spirit, our soul becomes sick, but they do the same thing with language. Language is the first and principal thing. When they take me out of my pueblo, out of my town, they rip me up at the roots as if I were a carrot. The carrot has deep, deep roots in the ground, and when you rip it up, little tiny pieces of those roots can remain hanging from the carrot. We were displaced to Los Angeles, but our little thin piece of our roots hanging from our carrot, or the radish, or the corn, or whatever plant you want to think of. And we have the obligation to give life to those roots. We need to put it in a glass and add water to it so that it will be born again and grow. When we are born again in this way, we will once again see the Zapoteco world. We will once again think, live, and eat in Zapoteco. Why can't we drink a delicious pozonte? It's very nutritious. It has cacao, cocoa. It has a root called cocolmeca that naturally cuts fat. Why do we have to go to a cafe, I won't say any names, to drink a latte? I don't understand this. And I'm saying, why not drink atole made from grains? But no, you drink something else. Why not drink mezcal instead of something else? So they kill us through our food, and our language is lost with our food, and the food is lost with our language. And without language, our spirit dies. Language is part of our daily life, and we who speak Zapoteco, it is a duty, it is obligatory to rescue Zapoteco. We can't be a carrot without roots and without leaves growing out from the top. We would be hollow. We would be human beings with no root, with no spirituality, with no thought process, with no Zapoteco thought process.
Thank you. Could I just add something? For myself, as a person who is learning my indigenous language, one of the things that is important to know is that there are not ways to express things from one language to another always. Sometimes you can get the gist of them, and I'm not talking about one word, I'm talking about an idea or a phrase or something referring to something. Sometimes there's just no way to translate it. And I'm sure this is true of not just indigenous languages, but other languages too throughout the world. So what happens as part of that is that you come to realize, for myself, that it also verifies that our ways are very distinct to who we are as a people. So, for instance, if you take words that have to do with land, it's not just land or a piece of soil or a piece of earth. It actually has to do with our beings and where our people come from. So that's a very different and grand idea to have to explain with just one word. So that's just a little added from my experience.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the problems are in the subtleties of the language, right? That you can translate anything into any language. It's just that there is something that gets lost in the translation. I mean, there are very rare times where there are concepts that can't be translated. The way that the Language Matters film opens up is with Charlie Mangolda, the last speaker of Amerdoc, this Aboriginal language. And in Amerdoc, there's no left or right in that language. Now, this is a concept that really gets deep into the consciousness. And if we lose Amerdoc and other languages like it, the few languages like it, we would not know that there are actually people who don't always think that the individual is the center of the universe. The only way that you can tell Charlie Mangolda when you're filming him, actually this is a little bit of a joke, you have to say to him, Charlie, would you mind moving your foot a little bit more to the southwest? Because in Amerdoc, it's only the cardinal directions that orient you to the universe. So what does it mean to have a language where you ain't it? Can you imagine that? Even just imagining it is such a wonderful thing, such a liberating thing to think these people could care less about how you're oriented. It's how the world is around you. You know, and at lunch today, I got to go back to this food thing one more time. You know, Odilia was talking about a case that I hope that she might bring up, where she was saying that in Zapotec, there's no word for ounce. You know, and this became really important in a court case. You know what I'm talking about?
Sí lo sé,
Yeah.
Bob.
I do know about.
Bueno, en el mundo
Well,
indígena,
in the
zapoteco,
indigenous world, in the
en el mío,
Zapoteco world, or that is in my world,
tampoco
in my
se
Zapotec
usa
world, that is,
mucho el derecho y el izquierdo. De hecho,
we don't really
se
actually
dice
talk a lot about right and
ichiyesh,
left. We say
franyesh.
ichiyesh,
O
changyesh.
sea, la
That is
cabeza del pueblo,
the
o
head
la
of the
la
pueblo,
parte,
or the
es lo
the high
mismo.
part, or the head part, or the
Y
below
eso
part.
en-
It's
en
the
sí
same
con
thing.
muchos
So
pueblos.
that happens with a lot of pueblos and a lot of
Dice
towns.
franyesh, ichiyesh,
So we'll use the words that mean
en-
above and below,
y
or at the
en-
top
y
of the
muchos
town, the
en
bottom
la
of the town. And
numerología no es que no
in our
tenemos
numerology, it's
números,
not that we don't have
contamos de a
numbers.
20s.
We
Pero en el
count it
caso
by 20s. But
occidental,
in
en este caso
the
particular del que
Western
estamos hablando
case,
en
in
la
the case
mañana,
that we were talking
a
about
la
this morning,
mamá,
the
a la mamá de
mother
este bebé le dicen que le
of
dé
a
en
baby,
onza.
they told her to feed the baby
Ella
in
no habla
ounces.
español,
She doesn't speak
habla muy poco
Spanish. She
español.
speaks very little Spanish.
Y ella no leyó,
And
no
she
siguió las
didn't
indicaciones.
follow
Y
the
cuando yo le digo,
directions.
pues no las siguió porque
And
el
she
mundo
did-
en onzas no existe. Le
She
tienes que
didn't follow the
mostrar
directions because
tanto del
ounces don't
vaso
exist
o
in her
tanto de
world. You give
leche,
this
pero no
much
le
of the
puedes
cup
decir
or
a
this
alguien que
much
no habla
milk, but you
español
can't
en onzas.
tell someone who doesn't speak
Eso no
Spanish,
les
onza,
importó, la
ounce.
familia
That
perdió sus
wasn't
niños.
important to
Porque
the
es un mundo
court. The family
diferente.
lost their
Y
children
los
because
jueces
they're in
se
a different
preguntan,
world. And
¿cómo
the
que no
judges
pueden
were
tener
asking,
onzas?
how could she not
¿Cómo que
understand
el
ounces?
zapoteco
How is that not
es
possible? That
zapoteco como el español,
Zapoteco
como el
is just
inglés?
like Spanish, it's
No,
just
no
like
es así.
English. But
El
that's not
zapoteco
true.
es único en cada
Zapoteco
variante,
is unique
y
in
nuestra
each of its
manera de ver la
variations.
vida
It's
es
unique,
muy
and our way of
diferente.
seeing
Y
life is
esto
very,
pone
very
muchas
different.
barreras aquí
And
en,
there are many
en las
barriers
ciudades.
here
Puede
in the
ser la ciudad de
cities.
Oaxaca, puede
Could be
ser
the city
la
of
Ciudad de
Oaxaca,
México,
it could
puede
be
ser aquí en
Mexico
Los
City,
Ángeles,
it could be here in
en
Los
Nueva York.
Angeles, in New
El
York,
no entender nuestro mundo
in not
te hace
we're not
juzgarnos
able to
que
understand the
nosotros
world we're
somos
in, and
unos
then we are
brutos
judged
y que no sabemos
because
y
they
que
think
no
we're
entendemos
stupid,
la
that we
vida
don't know
y que
things,
no
that we don't
podemos
understand life,
hacer
and that we
ciertas
can't
cosas.
do certain things.
Y no es que no las podamos
And it's
hacer.
not that we
Si
can't
tú
do
me las
them.
pides hacer
If
en mi
you
idioma,
ask me
yo
to
claro
do
que te
them
las
in
voy
my
a hacer.
language, of course I'm going to do whatever it is you
Si
ask.
tú me lo explicas
If
en
you
mi
explain
idioma,
in my language,
no es que yo sea tonta, tu
it's not that
idioma
I'm
y el mío no se
stupid.
parecen.
Your
Tu
language
mundo
and
y
my
el
language
mío
are
no-
not
no-
similar.
nada
Your
tienen que
world
ver.
and my world
Pero tú me
have
juzgas,
nothing to do
porque
with
eso
one
es lo
another,
que
but you
pasa
judge me,
cuando
because
uno
that
se
is what
enfrenta a
happens
los tribunales,
when you find
a los
yourself in court,
sistemas escolares de
or in the
Estados
school
Unidos, de
system in the
cualquier
United
ciudad,
States or any
donde no
city or
conocen que
place where
existen otros idiomas.
they don't realize that other
Hay
languages
muchos
exist. There are
prejuicios
many,
hacia
many
las comunidades
prejudices
indígenas,
toward indigenous communities
de todos lados, entonces
in everywhere.
automáticamente esa
So
familia le quitan
automatically,
sus hijos,
a family like that
porque no
gets their
muestra
children taken
cariño,
away because
porque
they're being
no lo
negligent, they're
abraza,
not showing
porque
care
no
for
le
their
dice
child, they're not
cosas que el
hugging their child, they're not
occidental dice.
saying things to them that a Western
Y esa
person
es
would
una
say.
injusticia que
And
pasa
that is an
todos los
injustice that
días
happens every day
en todos los tribunales de Estados
in
Unidos,
every
en las
courtroom in the
escuelas,
United States and
donde
in the
los
schools
niños
where
se van al
children
sistema,
go into a system
de cuidado a este sistema.
They go into a very cruel system, so children come into a world that they don't understand, a world that doesn't speak their language, a world that doesn't eat their food. And they leave those school experiences extremely traumatized. I can't give a lot of details in public about this case, but it's one of the most painful things I've ever seen. But for reasons of language and prejudice, equally of the Spanish language interpreter and other Latin American people, they took a daughter away from a family in an extremely cruel way simply because of a language misunderstanding.
Yeah. So the notion of an ounce is simply a whole different notion than the kind of weights that other languages might use in other cultures. And there's a lot of difference. There's, for example, Yurok has no north, south, east, west because they live on rivers, and the only way to get any place is to go upriver or downriver. And so their focus is on the rivers and on the hills around the rivers rather than on the cardinal directions. So there's just so many differences. And I'm sure that now with Vince and with Virginia, they had to learn their language as adults. They didn't learn their language as kids. It had been a generation or 2 generations or more since anyone had spoken their language. And I thought I'd ask you to begin, Virginia, with sort of how did you learn your languages, and what were some of the aha moments of learning the different concepts that came with your language?
You know, this journey wasn't one that I chose. It just kind of, the path was there and I followed it. And the Breath of Life conference that you host, Leanne, of course, was one of the door openers for me. My line of thinking was, I just want to learn a couple of words so I can sing a song or say a prayer. A very simple goal, right? But as I became connected with the different people who could help me, including, I call her my linguist, but she's not mine. It's Pam Monroe. She's out of UCLA, and she's basically been working with our group now for over 12 years. And what we're doing is, as a linguist, she's helping us learn how to say the words, how to pronounce them. There's very little that's recorded, but there is some, so we do have an idea. But it's basically doing the research, studying it. But more than that, it's being able to practice it. So in my case, when I first started to speak, I kind of took it like the same way when I learned Spanish. I learned Spanish as an adult, and it clued me into a lot of different concepts or ways that people who speak Spanish in Mexico, and for me it was Mexico City, clued me into what the character of the people was like because of the language. So I kind of took the same thing and said, okay, if I can learn how to distinguish if the people are talking in the past or in the present, then it kind of gives me a heads up onto what we're talking about. So taking that, it actually did help me to learn a little bit faster, I think, because I was able to say, okay, this is now and this was then. And I kind of just stuck to those two things. But when I was able to also share the language with my grandchildren, I started with my children, but they're all adults, and they were interested and they responded, but the children are much more natural. So I was able to basically use my grandchildren as the people that I'm conversing with, and since I was able to do that, I think it really helped me to really take in these things, because if I wanted to be able to say whatever the phrase was to that grandchild, I had to have it in me, and so I had to make sure it was there so that I would say it properly the first time. Because if I said it wrong the first time, I can correct it, but it's not the same for the child, because they're going to throw it back at me right the same way that I gave it to them. So it really, made me want to be more sure of how I was using the words, and it was just amazing. It was just amazing to see them come back with the same way. And now, I have a 15-year-old And when his little brother was born, I think he was maybe 7 or 8. And so I started the same thing, talking to the little brother, the baby, as he was learning. And then to hear him say the same thing that I said to the baby, it was like, oh, whoa, wait, I didn't expect that, but it's just a more fulfillment. But, it's continuing, and it's sometimes, of course it's frustrating because I don't know it all, but it's very fulfilling also, and to also see that the grandchildren are picking it up is just, it's just overwhelming. I can't even express that, but what I am very thankful for is that it is continuing, and I have the time and the resources and the energy to continue doing that.
Maybe just to say a little bit more about Breath of Life for people who haven't heard of it before.
Yeah.
This is something that we do up in Berkeley, that every other year we have a gathering of California Indians who come to find materials on their languages that are in the archives. So Berkeley and many other institutions have a long history of anthropologists and linguists who have documented the endangered languages of the United States. And Berkeley has one of the, if not the largest collection of materials on California Indian languages anywhere. So the the participants each get to work with a linguist who can help them figure out what the words on paper are all about, and then they're on their own to go ahead and learn their languages. So this conference had a little bit about, or it had in the title, it had, I think, what, Path to Extinction, or a Threat of Extinction. And people at Breath of Life have said, we do not like to use the word extinct. That, first of all, the people are not extinct. And secondly, if a language has any kind of documentation, it can be revitalized. And so that's what's happening in California, is that languages are being revitalized through, either through documentation, or if there are still a few speakers left, there's programs that our group, Vince and I both belong to the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival, and our group is trying to provide methods for people to learn their languages from the speakers, and also how to use them, right? That's the issue. You can learn a language, but if you're not passing it on, if you don't have anybody to talk to, that language is not really going to survive beyond you. And so language transmission is another important part of language revitalization. Vince, do you have some things you'd like to add about language learning from scratch?
Yeah. Well, as Leanne said, my language, I had to relearn the words. I wasn't raised speaking Chochenyo. Chochenyo is something that I began to connect with when I was a few words when I was a teenager, but then the bulk of it when I was in my early 20s. And I always wondered what our language sounded like. And I come from a really old Indian family from the East Bay. My family's never left the East Bay, where we've stayed exactly where our homeland's at in spite of everything that's happened. And that's something that we all have a lot of pride in. I grew up knowing my identity, knowing my connection to that land, knowing that I belong there, and knowing that I'm a Loni, knowing that I'm a Native person. But a lot of the specifics of our culture we didn't know, like our baskets weren't woven, a lot of those old songs weren't sung, our food wasn't eaten, and our language wasn't spoken. So I had a lot of family to go to and a lot of elders that I could go to ask questions. And for me, one of the people I've always gone to is my grandmother. And I asked her, I asked her questions about our language, and she told me that I should learn, and she encouraged me to go and learn. So I started working with simple word list at first, where I just barely began to understand what the language sounded like, little bits of words that I was at first even afraid to pronounce because I knew I was going to pronounce them incorrectly. But that was really my first glimpse into what our language sounded like. And then I was working with a good friend of mine named Linda Yamane, who is a basket weaver from the Ohlone area. And she introduced me to thousands of pages of notes from this linguist named John Peabody Harrington, who went around California and especially focused on areas in the Chumash area and the Ohlone area along the Central Coast. And he went to my community in the 1920s and 30s and recorded people who were living in the same area that my family was living in, the exact same space over in an area called Sanol in the old Rancheria. That's where my great-grandmother was born. And in that place, there were two old-timers that were living there who could remember our language, and they knew enough of it to record as much as they could. Their names were Angela de los Colos and Jose Guzman. They were both elderly people, both in their 70s, and they were recorded just about at the end of their lives, both of them. And they sat down and they shared as much as they could, not just about language, but as I said earlier, about every other part of culture that they could remember. And they told these things with this urgency, as if, if they weren't going to record it, that these things would just be forgotten. And if they didn't record these things, they likely wouldn't continue at all today. But they recorded these things with this urgency because they knew that they were the ones that were going to save this language. And they did. Today, as a result of their efforts, we can pick up those old notes and learn these words again. We can sit down with linguists and train ourselves to be linguists, to work with these notes and understand how to take these off the pages and how to speak them again in our homeland. And it's not just simply taking words off pages and speaking them, but it's a holistic healing experience for my community. Because when we're speaking these words that are meant to be spoken within the area that we originate from, when we use these words in the same places that our ancestors used these words, when we use these languages together, these words cut together collectively, we use them when we're reviving other aspects of our culture. We use them socially. We use them on Facebook and Twitter. We use them on Instagram. We use them in every medium we can. What it does is it allows us to be able to remember these, to hold these close to us, to hold these close to our hearts. And then when we use these words, it also, in so many ways, it gives us that respect for our old-timers who had those words taken from them. We're able to bring back something that so many people had stolen from them forcibly because other people didn't want them to speak those words. There was an old-timer who passed away named Phil Galvin, who was a relative of mine. He was born on the old Rancheria, and he remembered hearing the language spoken at the very beginning of his life. He passed away, he was born in the early 1920s. In the beginning years of his life, he could hear Churcheño spoken in the Rancheria. And for most of his life, because it stopped being spoken when he was a child, there was about 70, 80 years that the language wasn't spoken. And in the last years of his life, he heard the language spoken again by people in our family. He heard the language be used not just simply, in small ways, but being strung into conversations, being made into speeches, being published into literature, being made into all kinds of things that shows that this is a living language again. And I remember one day he pulled me aside and he told me, he said, "I'm glad I lived long enough to hear it a second time." So it reminds us, that things, when they're not fair, there's ways to repair them, to make them better. And when I go and work with my language to revive these words, I know I'm doing it for those old-timers, for the people who had those words taken from them, for our ancestors, but also for the future generations that are coming, that they'll be able to grow up in a world where this language is just spoken. And already this is happening. And I'll give you one example. I have a little brother, and he's 14 years old. And his name is Gabriel. And ever since he was 7 years old, he's been learning the Churcheño language. And he has conversational fluency in the language right now. And now he's teaching younger members of our family these words on his own. So it gives me a lot of pride to be able to know what's possible when those seeds are planted and those seeds are with good intentions to bring back things, to be able to continue this culture, then it shows that with the right energy, that it's possible to make this happen. Not just to revive, but to be able to continue the way that things are meant to be. So it brings me a lot of pride to be able to do that.
You know, I think Odilia is in the opposite end of language loss. That she's a native speaker of Zapotec, didn't even learn Spanish or English until she came to the United States, right? And what she's trying to do is to save the Zapotec language when it's in diaspora, where people are no longer in their homeland, and yet in LA, can we save Zapotec in LA? Would you say a few words about that?
Bueno, yo creo que
I think that Zapotec has a lot of future here in Los Angeles. Because even if we're not in our homelands, there are thousands of Zapotecs here. And here in LA is one of the largest diversities in Zapotec that exist anywhere. And I think, or I hope, that these movements that come from Zapotec language have this fruit to continue the language. We have an entire generation, my generation and the one following mine, and we speak the language. They brought us here as kids, and as I said earlier, it's our obligation to continue speaking our language here in Los Angeles, but it does have a great future. This new generation, my generation, when we arrived here, we didn't speak Spanish, because in the pueblo, where in my case we refused to learn English, to learn Spanish. They hit us with sticks to learn Spanish. And one thing that the kids did, the teacher was from a neighboring pueblo, a neighboring town called Medina, and we started saying, go, la perra de Yalina wants to hit us. And we would run out to run away. We would resist speaking Spanish. So when we got to LA, we encountered that nobody understood us. Nobody wanted to speak with us. And we asked ourselves, are you Indian? Yeah. Are you Mexican? Yeah. Why? Because really we didn't know what Indio meant, what indigenous meant, what Mexican meant. Because for us, I was Beneshusho. I'm from Sogocho, the person, the people from the river. But here, all of a sudden, I am Mexican, I am indigenous, I am India. And I always tell people, well, if that makes you happy, make me Chicana, Mexican, Latina, Hispanic, whatever, do it. But I know that I am Sogochans. I know that I am Beneshosho, and no one's going to take that away from me. And this generation refused, right? That generation refused to teach Zapotec to their kids because of all the racism and discrimination they encountered, not just from a new system, but from the same Mexicans themselves. Because we have to recognize that Mexicans are really racist. And when I say Mexicans, because I repeat, I am Beneshusho. I am not Mexican. I do not come from the Mexica nation. I'm from Sogosh. And we say, well, we didn't understand why we were so mistreated or why we were mocked. I lived very close here to the library. When I used to go to school, the kids were like, shh, shh, shh. And I said, okay. I didn't understand that they were mocking me. And a long time later, I realized they were mocking me. And so this generation decided not to teach Zapotec. A goal was to learn English and that your kids would go to school already speaking English. So that way they didn't have to suffer bullying or discrimination that communities, indigenous communities suffer right now, that they've always suffered. But the children of this generation now want to learn.
And that gives us a lot of hope. These children want to speak the language. The grandchildren of this generation, my granddaughter, she is interested in learning the language. Her mother we didn't teach her, but her daughter wants to learn it. So this new generation has a lot of hope, and I think we do have this hope to be able to save. I wouldn't say it wouldn't be the continuation of Zapotec, because Zapotec has been in resistance and in struggle for more than 526 years. And if we count that the Aztecs wanted to conquer us, that's actually a longer struggle. But we are still here 526 years later in Los Angeles, trying to continue our language. And I think that this seed is already showing its first fruits. There are many groups that are teaching Zapotec in different variants here. That's the idea, to be able to continue speaking Zapotec. I could run into someone on the bus today, they're on their cell phone speaking Zapotec. I could run into someone just calmly wearing their huipil in the middle of Los Angeles. We stopped that in the 80s. We stopped speaking the language, we stopped wearing our clothes. But here today, you can just walk around LA. I was on the bus the other day, and I went to the party, but the food wasn't really great. And they were speaking a language variant that I understood, and I started laughing. He realized I was laughing, and I was like, what do I say now? He understood me, but this made me really happy to find people like that here in LA. There's a lot of hope that Zapotec will continue here for new generations.
I think people would like to hear a little bit about the organization that you work with in New York.
Yeah, the Endangered Language Alliance is devoted. We have an urban field station where we do a lot of recording of languages. We're attempting to make a language census of New York City. We estimate that there are over 800 languages in the 5 boroughs. And we've enumerated up to 400 now, and almost 100 of them are endangered languages or treasure languages, as some people like to call them. And for me, it's a wonderful town meeting place, sort of like this room in here, where all these languages cross over. We have classes in Lenape, for example, the original language of Manhattan. Anushik, we say in Lenape when we're greeting people. You know, what I love hearing today is people in their mother tongues telling us who they are, and for us to listen to the truth of who they are in the way that the individual speaks. If you don't hear it that way, you ain't getting it straight. And, you know, I want to love this country. I want to love these United States, because this is the place where mongrels like all of us, except a few of us, can come and find a home. But to find a home with the people who lived here originally is a lot different from the way that we were taught and the way that colonialism occupied these lands. Now, at the very least, we can help these languages and cultures that have managed to survive these centuries to find themselves again, for these identities to be realized, and for these languages to be heard. I want to challenge all of you to look into your own pasts and find the languages of your past wherever they are. I'm going to bet that most of you have, within a few generations, a so-called endangered language yourself back there. You know, my grandparents, as I mentioned on the one side, came from Ukraine. They spoke Yiddish. You know, the Hebrew, the language of Israel, was quote, extinct for 700 years before the Jews decided that this had to be the language of Israel, the official language. And it was brought back to life so that now it is the language of that country. Unfortunately, the spoken languages of that time, like my grandparents spoke Yiddish, and then there's Ladino for the Sephardic Jews. Those languages now are endangered because Yiddish was brought back and became the official language. So the spoken languages of the shtetl are, you can't hear them so much anymore, though people are trying to bring those back as well. It's complicated, right? But Ukrainian, that my grandparents also spoke, was always a minority language in Ukraine. Russian was the primary language, or for the last 150 years or so. Until 10 years ago. Until a few years ago when Putin grabbed Crimea and people said, wait a minute, why are we speaking Russian? And without any Endangered Language Alliance or any other movement, people decided on their own it was time to pick up Ukrainian again and speak it. And now Ukrainian is the majority language in Ukraine and not Russian. You all have these stories in your own languages. On the other side, Sally, my mother, the child of the coal miner, if you'll remember, is from Wales. And so when I went to Welsh and learned that the town that my relatives lived in was Llanfair, Pwt Gwyngyth, Gogera, Cwyr, and Robert Llanfair, Gogogoch, the little town with the long name, it helped me in learning a little bit of Welsh to do in that movie also. Who you are is those languages of all of our lineages. You know, yes, English is a great language for us to communicate in. But when you're with a lot of indigenous people and you say, "What languages do you speak?" English isn't mentioned, because languages mean who you are, and English is a great way of getting along. We need it. It's a fantastic language. I've got 10 books in it. One is available, blah, blah, blah. But who you are those languages that you come from. So the Endangered Language Alliance in New York, if we can even use that word, I don't know, but at any rate is a place where all those languages can come together and commune, and in its way kind of mirrors what's going on here today.
You, we're going to stop in just a moment and ask for questions. But I just thought I would ask Virginia to say the last word as the person whose land we're on. What do you envision for your language, for the future of your language?
You know, it's I'm one person, but I always think of everyone else, and by everyone else I mean all my tribal members, all my tribal families, both going back, all the ancestors, and going forward, all the children and the young people. And that's the way we're taught to think. And when I started with the language, I remember being very disappointed because, okay, I can learn a few words, but there's not an entire language. At this point, you know, however many years later, I look at it and I think, I'm never going to get to the end of it. It's just so much. But, you know, I get a lot of inspiration, I think, from when I think about the elders. When I worked with the tribe, I was able to speak with a lot of families, and every time I would meet an elder, I would always ask them, do you speak the language? Did you hear the language? Did you ever hear it? And I asked many people, and I only got one person that answered, and he said, yes, I remember my grandmother said these words to me, and he spoke them. And that alone just made it all come alive to me and make the connection. So for me, it's all about connections. And when I share with the children, it's all about helping them to connect with who they are as a person, who their family was, who their ancestors were. When we look at the landscape, and we're in an urban area, and Vincent and I were talking about this, it's very difficult when you are in a giant urban area. And when I was a child, it wasn't all urban. It was still developing. There was still a lot of open land. But one of the things I try to bring across to the children is that this is your land. We take care of it. And this is how you call your land. And I'm able to tell them Hai for the mountains. I'm able to tell them Momte for the ocean. I'm able to tell them Wenot for the rivers. And these are the words they're starting to use. And for me, that's the blessing that we all get, is to be able to have a continuance onto the future of who our people are. And like Leanne says, we're not extinct, we're still here. And we still want to be a part of this wonderful land and be the caretakers of it. And the language is just one of the aspects that's helping us carry it into the future for our children.
Thank you. So we'd like to open up to questions that any of you have. And I think there's going to be a mic passed around, too, for people that have questions.
Cultures have?
It's not on. There you go.
Hi. What I was going to ask is there one word that you actually share? I mean, is there one word that goes through generations in different cultures? One?
I'm sorry. Say it again.
It's like hi. You could say hi in all your different ways. Is similar. Like no. No is a word that is said through all languages.
Uh-huh.
Is there one word for you guys that has almost the same way?
Almost the same way to say hello.
Yeah.
Well, I should say, by the way, that, I'll start, if you don't mind. Maybe everybody would like to answer. But I went to, let's see, we were studying Mixtec once at Berkeley, and we asked the speaker, how do you say hello? And he said, well, you don't. We know everybody. So, we might say, how's your family, or something like that, but we're not going to say hello. And I had the same experience with the Havasupais, which are in Arizona, when that there was no word for hello in the language. There now is, because people have taken on some of the culture of English. And so they'll say Gamyu now in Havasupai, which means how are you? But normally, it said, since you know everybody, why do you say hello? You might say, I'd say, well, what do you say when you meet somebody on the path? And they'd say, oh, I'd say, where are you going? So maybe some of you have other answers to hello.
I do. I'd like to share. So when I began, I said meiha, and it goes pretty much along the same line. There really is no way to say hello in our language. And what we do say for the greeting is meiha, or sometimes just mei. And basically, it means, how's it going? Or where are you going? What's happening with you? So there's no need to say hello because the door's already open. Now it's like, okay, what's going on? How's it going? So I kind of, when I discovered this meaning, I kind of looked at it with our young people. They say, hey, what's up?
What's up?
What's up? That's all it is. It's like, tell me about you. Here we are, face to face. Now tell me about you. So it's getting past, the formal, greeting, and it's past that.
Well, I'll do one in Welsh. Hoyle is hi and also goodbye. But I want to tell you how it's spelled. It's spelled H-W-Y-L, Hoyle. Okay? Now, this is the Welsh love to use the Greek alphabet like we all are using, right? Except that they don't. You have to relearn what every sound means in it. This is because they live in Cymru. Cymru, which is the way the Welsh say Wales. C-Y-M-R-U. Khumri. Got it? Now, here's my question to you. How come the whole world calls, or in the English-speaking world, calls Wales, Wales, which is a Saxon word that means those other guys? So in Wales, the way they have to speak when they're speaking English is, we are those other guys. Why can't we be ourselves? Because if we're ourselves, we would be living in Khumri. Thank you. Hoyle.
Well, with us, there is a word, but it's, bueno, con nosotros.
With us, there's a word that is used, padiush, but this is a borrowed word from Spanish. So usually, if you meet up with someone on the path, we say, "Are you coming?" or "Where are you going?" But with Spanish people, we borrowed this word, padiush, which basically is the same thing as hola or hi. Are you coming or are you going is how we would say it. But it's important to take into account that this is something we've borrowed from Spanish.
I'm wishing I'd paid more attention to my grandparents who spoke Maltese. But the question I have for you is, how do you deal with the special considerations of preserving indigenous languages when dealing with a deaf community?
There are many endangered deaf languages of the deaf, many endangered sign languages in particular. And perhaps that's not what you meant, though, of dealing with the deaf community. Okay. That there's so many sign languages that have been developed in local areas, especially when there's a large percentage of deaf people, which sometimes happens in isolated communities, that there is maybe 10 or 20% even of the community that might be deaf. And so there's a lot of these local languages, and there are linguists that are trying to document these languages. And what happens sometimes, for example, I think in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, there's a deaf language, a deaf sign language that was just developed by people in their communities. And then they had a school for the deaf. And then once you have a school for the deaf, then all of a sudden these local languages start to disappear, and you get ASL or some version of ASL instead. So ASL is sort of the encroaching language for people who might have learned a local language when they grew up.
Similar to the way English is a bully language.
Right.
Although you probably know that ASL, American Sign Language, is more similar to French Sign Language than it is to British Sign Language. But don't get us started on it. Just to say that the last language I think that was discovered in Hawaii alone was Hawaiian Sign Language, which just became known about 10 years ago, or at least documented.
Right, right.
So I understand your primary reason for preserving your language is for your own culture, but do you have hopes of sharing your language with other cultures as well? And maybe through an app like Duolingo?
Well, our primary goal right now, as you said, is to keep this within our communities because, we've seen what happens when our culture can be exploited. You know, there's not a good track record of that, really. So we want to do what we can to keep what's ours within our community. One day, if we do decide to share this outside of, our community, it would be, I think, a healing thing if one day, Chochenyo could be a prominent spoken language within the Bay Area, but that would have to be something that has community consensus, that's led by our tribal leadership and our elders first and foremost, and it would have to be something that that's done respectfully, because I think that what happens often is people, they want to feel connected. They want to feel connected to these languages and to the land and all of this. And people who don't have the connection to these places, like how indigenous people do, they often want to know about what is indigenous to this place. But just because you have a curiosity doesn't necessarily make you the right person to learn these things. And I think that there's importance to understand what's sacred, what's important, because we don't want our language to be appropriated. We don't want our language to be, something that we see used casually, because for us it's a sacred thing, it's a living thing, and it connects us to our land and to our ancestors. But in the future, if there ever was a time that was appropriate after our community has enough grounding with the revival, then I think that's something that could have a discussion, but it's not something that one person can decide, and it's not something that can be taken lightly, I don't think.
For myself, I just wanted to add that, like I said in the beginning, I just wanted to be able to sing a song in my language or be able to say a prayer. And it's a little bit more than that now, but I feel like we are sharing it when I go to a school or when I go to a college, wherever I'm invited, and I share a song in my language. I feel like I am sharing it, because even before, as we introduce a song, we say what it's for and what its meaning is, so that there is some kind of understanding for whoever the public is out there, whatever their language may be. So another instance, people sometimes call they want to know a few words, just so they can share. And the example has been, there's been several plays that have been written that include something with Tongva people, and they want that Tongva person to say a word in the language. So I think we are sharing it to an extent, but there's also the aspect of, I feel like I need to concentrate on our tribal people first.
Well, we don't want to be rude or, be disrespectful, but we're trying to continue in the case of the Zapotecs like us, the language here in Los Angeles, and we've had really bad experiences when we opened the doors to our communities. In the case of the Sierra Norte, a lot of academics went in, and at the end of the day, the report of our lands and our languages was handed over to the U.S. government. Why? Because we have mines and water. So, we would hope that everyone would understand our world, but at the same time, that way you can learn how we see ourselves. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, because the experiences we've had in La Sierra Norte, now we've lost so many leaders from the loss of lands and the mines. People have to keep fighting, because once upon a time we had trust in certain people. It's one of those things that is so difficult, and we have great allies like Bob and Leanne and Aaron who support us, so the language has continued. But it's a very difficult situation. I feel like Vincent says it has to be done with a lot of respect. But I think for now, we're going to focus on decolonizing ourselves as Zapotecs here in Los Angeles and revalue our own language and say the importance and recover this world that we're losing day by day when generations and generations haven't spoken it. So I think that is our priority focus.
Hi there. Thank you, everyone, for coming and speaking of your experiences. I greatly appreciate it. I'm sure the whole audience does. Something I wanted to ask, I am a computational linguist, and something I'm really interested in is language justice and how it relates to language technologies. So I think, that each person has the right to interact, because it's rising. You can talk to your phones now. You can talk to various devices in your home. I think people should be able to do that in their native languages. And if a linguist, say, approached, you and your community, what sort of things should they keep in mind to be culturally sensitive to your needs if they wanted to help you develop ways to interact with technology?
Bueno, nosotros estamos trabajando con
I think that we are working with Aaron Huey
Shanenshine.
Shanenshine. We call him Aaron Huey Shanenshine because of the way his name is written. But he's the only poor Aaron. He's not here today, but he's the only one who we said, all right, Juanito, we're gonna work with you, but under our own terms. You are going to develop an alphabet for us with the English phonetics, because I don't want to write something that you can't read. I have many things in Zapotec, in Sucocho, the Bible, for example, a dictionary that I can't read. And so we decided to create something based on our needs, and this goes hand by hand with the decolonization process, because usually we think, oh, he's a güerito, he's studying, you have to listen to him. But no, to Aaron, we told him we are going to develop our own vocabulary. We want to do it in the way that we can actually read it, and that our people can read it. And if the people decide to write it however they want, then we'll adjust it for them so that they're able to read it, and create a program where folks can play with that. We're currently experimenting with this right now, but that's kind of like the new terms, right? They have to be to the benefit of the community and not for...
I have... Okay, let me just say a little bit too, then one more question. Technology can be especially useful to people when the community is in diaspora. And there's certainly many tribes in the United States that are using social media, that are using any kind of technology that would allow people who are in different places to be able to experience the language or communicate with each other. So it can be useful. It's not always useful, but it can be really helpful in diaspora. And I know a number of people who use it that way. Not necessarily with linguists helping them, though. Okay, one more question.
And then I wanted to just remind you there's a reception in the courtyard. I hope you'll all stay and talk to our guests and explore the Antena Mobile and the books for sale. And I know that at the end, after our question, we'll give this group a great hand. So here's our last question.
Thank you so much. I came to the States in 1975, so it's the mid-70s. And I remember going to school as a child here on the West Side. And I remember it was a very anti-immigrant environment in the 70s. And there weren't any interpreters in the schools, and so I had to interpret Spanish and English for my mom when she came to the schools for any parent conference, open houses, etc. When my kids grew up, when I had my own kids, I, with a collective, worked really hard to get interpreters in the classrooms, in the schools, and so forth, so parents no longer have to do that. I felt like there was an attack on our cultures back then, and I haven't felt that as I am feeling it, starting to feel it again. And so I hear you all saying that you're hopeful. You're hopeful that your grandkids will pick up the language because your kids didn't, or so forth. And I'm wondering if you're feeling the same way about this nationalism that's going on in the conversation currently, and what that means to your strides and the steps you've taken forward, and whether you feel kind of a threat again.
Who would like to?
Fear, we're talking about fear. We always got to take the step ahead and remove that fear and put it to one side and just take our best step forward. And I think that, as a person who was active and involved with the social movements of the 60s and 70s, yes, that was definitely a time where a lot of change, fortunately, did occur slowly over the years, but I think there was a mental change in some of the people who would have been considered the underdogs at that time. The landscape has changed quite a bit now because a lot of people have, I think, a more open view, and there has been a lot of change, a dramatic change in our area here. So I think I don't feel fear, but I feel that there's a time and there's a place, and I think the limits are going to be pushed to where they are, and then the people will speak. And that's what happened in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't planned. It was something that happened out of the outcry of the people. And if it needs to happen again, I think it will.
Bueno,
Well,
como pueblos originarios,
as
pueblos indígenas,
original peoples, as indigenous peoples, we have been fighting for so
son más de
long.
525
There's been more than 525
Cada
years.
presidente
Each
en
president
México,
in
en cualquier
Mexico,
parte del mundo,
any part of the
llega con
world,
las mismas intenciones.
comes with the
Ahora
same
se
intentions.
escucha y
Now we hear
es
this,
más obvio,
and it's more obvious.
pero el diferente
But
no es diferente
it's
el número
no
45,
different.
el
45 is
presidente
no
número
different
44,
from 44 or 43 or the first one.
todos vienen
They all come
a querer desaparecer los pueblos
to
originarios.
they want
a
to disappear the
desaparecer
original
nuestras
peoples. They want to
nuestras
disappear
costumbres.
our languages,
Pero
our
¿saben qué?
culture, our traditions. But you know what?
Hemos luchado tanto
We
tiempo y
have
vamos a
fought and
seguir.
struggled for so long.
Y
We're going to
vamos
keep
a
on
seguir
struggling.
ahora
And we're going
más
to
que
keep
nunca.
now more than
Porque
ever
yo me
because
rehuso como
I
mujer zapoteca,
refuse, as a
como
Zapotec
mujer
woman,
sogochense,
as a Sogochense
ver el
woman,
mundo
I refuse
de
to
la
see the
manera que
world
el nuevo-
in the way
el número
that
45
number
lo ve
45 sees it.
y
and
de sus malhechores. Así les
all
voy a
his
llamar.
other evildoers. That's what I'm
Todo
going to
su
call them.
equipo de
His
bandidos,
whole
me
team
rehuso
of
a ver ese
bandits. I
mundo así.
refuse to see the world that way.
Me
I
rehuso a ver
refuse
el
to
mundo
see the world
como el número
like
45.
number
Me
45
rehuso
sees
a
it.
decir
I
su
refuse
nombre
to
en
say
público.
his name in public
Porque no voy a
because
permitir
I'm not going
que
to
a mi
allow
pueblo le metan
my
miedo.
peoples to
Mi
be
pueblo ha
in fear.
resistido y va a
My
continuar
people have
resistiendo
resisted and they're going to
aquí y en
continue
todas
resisting
partes.
here and in
Nosotros
anywhere.
somos
We
los
are
verdaderos
the real
americanos,
Americans.
si quieren llamarnos
If you're going to call
americanos.
us Americans,
Nosotros somos de
we
estas
are
tierras.
of these
Somos del
lands.
pueblo de Aviala
We are
y aquí
of
nos vamos a
Abiyala,
quedar.
and this is where we're going to stay.
Y si nuestra lucha es
And
cuesta
if our
arriba,
struggle is up
lo
there,
vamos a llevar
we're
y si
gonna,
nos toca morir, moriremos
and
de
if we're
pie.
going to die, we're going to die
Pero
again,
no vamos a
standing
dejar
up.
que el
But we're
número
not going to let
45 nos meta
45
miedo. Y ahora es
scare
mucho
us,
más
and
importante
now more than ever,
que
it's so
hablemos
important
y
that we
rescatemos de nuestros
speak
idiomas y
and we
nuestras
rescue
lenguas.
our languages
¿Por qué?
and our cultures.
Bueno,
Why?
esto ya va a terminar,
Why? This
esta
is going
plática,
to end,
pero
this
yo
talk is
les
going
voy
to
a
end.
decir,
But I'm
ahí
going to tell you,
yo, Vishanga, ahí los voy a ver en unos cuantos soles.
I'm going to see us
No
in
te
a
estoy
few
diciendo te veo en otro
suns.
día.
I won't tell
O te
you
veo
I'll see you in
15
another
días.
day
No
or in
te
15
veo.
days.
Si
I'll
te veo
see
en 2
you.
semanas, te
If I
estoy
see you
diciendo
in
te
2
veo
weeks,
14
I'm
soles.
telling you
O
I'm just going to
14
see you in
amaneceres
14,
de soles,
14
si quiero ser
suns,
poética como
14
Bob.
dawns if I want to be a poet like
Pero
Bob.
no es te veo en 15 días y en 2
It's not,
semanas.
I'll
Mi idioma
see
no
you
es
in
tan
2 weeks and
simple.
15
Y yo no quiero ser
days. My
simple
language is
como el
not
número
that simple,
45.
and I don't want to be as simple as 45.
I had one comment as well, and we've really been seeing right now in the Bay Area, in my homeland. I live in Berkeley, and there's been we've been seeing these white nationalist rallies coming in on a pretty regular basis, and the hate and the fear that they're trying to spread is very tangible. It's very obvious and it's very visible. And it's also very frustrating. But what I feel in my heart is we've survived far worse than this. We know that we come from power. We know we come from strength. We come from people who survived the genocide. We came from people who survived the missions Every single worst part of the history that has come to us, my family has found a way to survive this. And it's not to brush over the fact that many people, many countless people did not survive this. And it's important to remember that we come, though, from these powerful people who guide us and allow us to continue our language, to allow this to persist. So when people ask me, I tell them, we'll get through this too. And I think that seeing what's happening right now gives us the pressure to respond. And how do we respond? For me, the way that I respond is by trying to do everything I can to bring back what people are trying to take away, and by breathing that life into language and other aspects of culture. It's important to be able to continue with these things so that, like Virginia was talking about, our future generations and our ancestors will be able to see this and be proud of it. So thank you.
So thank you all, and I know there were a lot of questions that you couldn't ask, but hopefully you will just come to any of us during the reception. We'd be very happy to talk to you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.